Hello, welcome back to MOOC course on Environmental Humanities. This is lecture number 14 and we are into week 3. In the previous discussions, we explored how climate fiction employs literary strategies such as satire, irony, and speculative narrative to represent emotional concerns, environmental concerns. We examined how writers use different narrative techniques to critique environmental exploitation and encourage reflection on climate change. Now, in this lecture, we will turn our attention to another important aspect of climate narratives, the relationship between intimacy and scale. Climate change is often discussed as a global phenomenon, yet people experience its effects through homes, families, communities, and everyday life. The text studied in this module, in this particular lecture, the text studied together here in the text that we have discussed, they are of different representations, connecting personal experiences with planetary concerns. Understanding this movement between the intimate and the global helps us appreciate how climate fiction makes environmental issues meaningful to readers. Let us begin by exploring what we mean by intimacy and scale within the climate narratives. Climate change is frequently described through large numbers, global statistics, and planetary processes. We often hear about rising temperatures, melting glaciers, biodiversity loss, and environmental crises affecting entire regions of the world. While these large-scale perspectives are important, they do not always capture how people experience climate change in their everyday lives. Literature offers a unique way of bridging this gap. Climate fiction often brings global environmental issues into intimate space such as homes, families, workspaces, and the local communities. Through individual experiences, readers are able to understand the human dimensions of environmental change. This relationship between intimacy and scale is one of the defining features of contemporary climate fiction. Writers frequently move between personal stories and larger environmental systems, showing how global processes influence everyday life and how individual experiences reflect broader ecological realities. So, the texts that we are discussing here, they illustrate this connection in different ways. Some focus on families and communities dealing with environmental change, while others expand outward to depict planetary crisis and large-scale ecological transformation. So, by examining these different scales of representations, we can better understand how climate fiction communicates environmental concerns and why certain narratives resonate so strongly with readers. To begin this discussion, let us first define the concepts of intimacy and scale and consider how they operate within climate narratives. In climate narratives, intimacy refers to the personal emotion and everyday experiences through which individuals encounter environmental change. Unlike scientific reports or global climate statistics, intimate narratives focus on the lives of people, families, and communities. They bring environmental concerns into familiar spaces such as homes, workplaces, farms, and local environments. As a result, climate change is experienced not as an abstract global issue, but as something that directly affects daily life. One reason intimate representations are important is that they make environmental crisis more relatable. Readers may find it difficult to connect emotionally with large-scale discussions of climate change, but they can often relate to stories about families facing uncertainty, communities struggling with environmental disruption, or individuals adapting to changing conditions. This can be seen in flight behavior, where climate change enters everyday rural life through unusual ecological events and their impact on a local community. In The Hungry Tide presents environmental concern through the experiences of people living on the edge within a fragile ecosystem. In both the texts, environmental change is understood through personal relationships, livelihoods, and community experiences. By focusing on ordinary lives, intimate narratives help readers see the human dimensions of climate crisis. They remind us that environmental change is not only a scientific or political issue, but also an experience that shapes emotions, relationships, and everyday realities. While intimacy allows us to view climate change at the level of individual experience, climate fiction also engages with much larger environmental processes. To appreciate the full scope of these narratives, we must now consider the idea of scale and examine how climate change is presented at broader planetary level. So, intimacy focuses on personal and local experiences. Scale refers to broader environmental systems and processes that operate at regional, global, or even planetary levels. Climate change is not simply the result of individual actions. It is connected to complex environmental, political, economic, and technological systems that shape the world on a much larger scale. These processes often extend beyond the control of any single person or community, making climate crisis appear vast, complex, and sometimes overwhelming. Large-scale representations help readers understand the magnitude of environmental challenges. They draw attention to issues such as global warming, ecological collapse, biodiversity loss, and large-scale environmental transformations that affect entire societies and ecosystems. This perspective is particularly evident in The Stone Gods. The novel expands beyond individual experiences to depict planetary destruction and repeated cycles of ecological collapse. By presenting environmental crisis on such an immense scale, the text emphasizes the long-term consequences of human actions and interconnected nature of environmental systems. A similar sense of scale appears in The Rapture, where environmental instability develops into a global catastrophe. Although individual characters remain important, the narrative continually points towards larger ecological forces that extend far beyond personal control. Scale, therefore, helps readers recognize that climate change is not only a local concern but also a systemic and planetary challenge. It broadens our understanding of environmental crisis by revealing the larger structures and processes within which individual experiences take place. When intimacy and scale are considered together, climate fiction becomes particularly powerful. It connects personal experiences within planetary realities, allowing readers to understand both the human and environmental dimensions of climate change. With these concepts in mind, let us now examine how different scales of representation influence our understanding of climate crisis in the texts. The concepts of intimacy and scale become particularly useful when we examine how climate change is represented in different literary texts. The scale through which a narrative presents environmental issues can significantly influence how readers understand and respond to climate crisis. At an intimate scale, climate change is experienced through individual lives, family relationships, and everyday concerns. Flight behavior is a good example of this approach. Rather than focusing on global climate systems, the novel presents environmental change through the experiences of a rural household. Readers encounter climate crisis through familiar situations, personal struggles, and local ecological disruptions. This makes the issue more immediate and emotionally accessible. A slightly broader perspective appears in The Hungry Tide, which operates at the level of communities and local environments. Here, environmental change affects groups of people whose lives are closely connected to the ecosystem of the Sundarbans. Through experiences of displacement, vulnerability, and livelihood challenges, the novel highlights how climate change is lived and experienced within specific communities. These forms of representation are important because they humanize environmental issues. They encourage readers to see climate change not only as scientific problems, but also as reality that affects people's lives, relationships, and sense of belonging. By focusing on personal and community experiences, these texts create emotional engagement with and help readers connect with environmental concerns in meaningful ways. However, climate fiction does not remain limited to intimate or local perspectives. Other texts expand the scale of representation and reveal the larger environmental systems within which these experiences occur. Let us now consider how broader scales of representation contribute to our understanding of climate crisis. While intimate and community-based narratives make climate change personally meaningful, larger scales of representation help readers understand the magnitude and complexity of environmental crisis. This broader perspective is particularly evident in The Stone Gods. The novel expands beyond individual experiences to depict environmental collapse on a planetary and even interplanetary scale. Entire civilizations face ecological destruction, forcing societies to confront the long-term consequences of unsustainable practices. By presenting environmental crisis at such a vast level, the novel encourages readers to think beyond immediate concerns and consider the cumulative effects of human actions across generations. Large-scale representations such as this highlight the interconnected nature of environmental systems. They remind us that climate change is not confined to specific places or communities, but has consequences that extend across regions, nations, and even the planet as a whole. A different dimension of scale appears in The Rapture, where the novel addresses global catastrophe. It also explores how individuals perceive and respond to such crises. Environmental instability creates feelings of uncertainty, fear, and anxiety, linking personal consciousness with larger ecological events. In this way, the narrative operates simultaneously at both psychological and global levels. This combination is significant because it demonstrates that climate change is experienced not only through the physical environmental changes but also through emotions, beliefs, and perceptions. The scale of the crisis influences how people imagine the future and understand their place within a changing world. Taken together, these texts show that different scales of representation reveal different aspects of climate crisis. Intimate perspectives create emotional connection, while larger scales highlight complexity, consequences, and systemic change. This raises an interesting question. Which type of representation is more effective in communicating environmental concerns? To explore this issue, let us compare intimate and large-scale representations more directly. The different scales discussed so far invite us to consider an important question. How do intimate and large-scale representation influence our understanding of climate change? Intimate representations focus on individuals, families, and local communities. Rather than presenting climate change through the global statistics or scientific data, these narratives show how environmental change affects everyday life. Readers encounter climate crisis through personal experiences, relationships, and local environments. This approach is clearly visible in flight behavior. The novel presents climate change through the experiences of local people. And similar perspective appears in The Hungry Tide. The novel explores environmental vulnerability through the experiences of communities living in the Sundarbans. Ecological changes affect livelihoods, mobility, and survival, allowing readers to understand climate crisis through human experiences and local realities. So, one of the strengths of intimate representation is its ability to create emotional engagement. Readers often connect more easily with individual stories than with large-scale environmental processes. Through empathy and personal identification, climate change becomes something that affects real people rather than abstract global issue. This emotional dimension is particularly important because it helps because it helps readers recognize the human consequences of environmental change. Intimate narratives therefore play a significant role in making climate crisis relatable, meaningful. At the same time, climate fiction also employs larger scales of representation. Now look at the larger ones. Large scale representations draw to the broader environmental systems and consequences associated with climate change, which is visible in the stone gods. The scale of the narrative highlights the immense consequence of human actions and demonstrates how ecological crisis can affect entire societies over long periods of time. Then the similar sense of scale is in The Rapture. The novel depicts environmental instability and the possibility of global catastrophe. So rather than focusing solely on local experiences, that these two texts direct the attention towards environmental processes that affect the whole world. So large scale representations are effective because they emphasize the urgency and seriousness of climate change. They reveal that environmental problems are not isolated events but interconnected challenges with far reaching consequences. So that helps readers understand the complexity of climate systems and systemic nature of ecological crisis. They can sometimes appear distant or overwhelming. This is why many climate narratives move between intimate and large scale representations, combining emotional engagement with an awareness of larger environmental realities. This interaction between these different scales becomes especially important when global environmental concerns enter personal and domestic spaces. Now, let us see the emotional impact of bringing global crisis into this. So, one of the most powerful effects of climate fiction is its ability to bring large scale environmental concerns into personal and emotional spaces. When global crises are experienced through individual lives, readers are able to connect with environmental issues at a deeper emotional level. In flight behavior, climate change gradually enters everyday rural life through unusual ecological events and changing environmental conditions. So, what initially appears as a local phenomenon gradually reveals its connection to a larger climatic processes. As characters become more aware of these changes, they experience uncertainty, concern, and a growing recognition of environmental vulnerability. The emotional impact of the novel emerges from the process of realization. So, climate change is no longer something happening elsewhere, it becomes part of everyday life and personal experiences. A different emotional response appears in The Rapture. Here, environmental instability is associated with fear, anxiety, and psychological distress. Apocalyptic visions and predictions of catastrophe create an atmosphere of uncertainty that affects both individuals and communities. The boundary between personal experience and global crisis becomes increasingly blurred. These texts demonstrate that environmental change is not experienced only through physical transformations in the environment, but it also shapes emotions, perceptions, and the ways of imagining the future. Climate fiction, therefore, helps readers understand the emotional dimensions of environmental crisis and the ways in which global concerns become deeply personal. These emotional responses often lead to broader questions about responsibility, justice, ethical action, which brings us to the next dimension of our discussion, which is the ethical impact on bringing global crisis into intimate spaces. So, beyond emotional responses, it's important to talk about this also. This ethical dimension is visible in The Hungry Tide, which you know that human needs and environmental conservation have a clash. Communities are living on the edge, and the ecosystem is also very fragile. So, the ecosystem requires protection and people need survival. So, characters are navigating uh, the responsibilities as well as their problems. The novel encourages readers to reflect on the holistic aspect of this situation. How should societies balance conservation with human welfare? So, this is relevant to understand that it is not easy to just tell story from one end, because there are people who are living on the margins. They need some kind of survival, and then they are also paying the price of something which they are not part of. So these questions become more complex because these communities are very vulnerable. Then a different shade appears in The Stone Gods. The novel is repeatedly emphasizing humanity's failure to learn from their mistakes. Despite the fact that they have knowledge and technological capabilities, the societies are continuously behaving in a reckless manner. This raises questions about the collective responsibility and the ethical consequences of ignoring environmental warnings. So, through these narratives, climate fiction encourages us to think critically about the moral dimensions of environmental crisis. Climate change is not simply scientific or political issue, it is also an ethical challenge that requires reflection on responsibility, accountability, and future generations. So, we have explored both the emotional and ethical impacts of climate narratives. Now, let us conclude with a brief activity that allows you to apply some of the ideas discussed here. The activity is that you have to write a short monologue uh, on a global climate crisis like extreme heat, flooding, food shortage, anything that comes to your mind, and that you think you are also part of, you have also been impacted directly or indirectly. Write a monologue about it, and that will help you understand the situation of the people that have been depicted in these texts. The books that I have consulted are presented here. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much. I meet you in a different lecture.